Hello and welcome. This is Blaine Bartlett, and you're listening to The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. Um, you know, this whole question of leadership, I've spent my entire career on leadership, working with leaders around the world. And, there's a couple of things that I want to just kind of mark out here before I introduce my guest. Leadership, I don't think, is really well understood because most people confuse leaders with titles. And that is a non-starter in many ways. Leaders cause movement at the end of the day. And I'm going to be very simplistic here. Leaders cause movement. And I don't care what your title is in an organization. The minute you step in the door, you're causing movement. So the question isn't, are you a leader or not? By definition, you are. Are you causing the kind of movement that you need to get the result that you want? That's a different question. And that's where leadership comes into play. And leadership can be learned. And my guest today, Elizabeth Freedman, is a leadership expert. And I mean that very specifically. There's not a whole lot of folks that I will assign that label to. But Elizabeth has been in the game for a fair amount of time. She's worked with C-level executives around the world with some companies that you'd be very familiar with: Dow, Boeing, State Street, Bristol Myers Squibb, who is also a client of mine. Just full disclosure here, Disney. But the point here is that she works with the question of how do you be effective as a leader, regardless of what your title is. Regardless of what your title is. And she is a senior member of the BTS leadership team. And BTS is a large consulting firm that specializes in this space. They're headquartered out of Sweden. And she heads up their BTS East grouping here. So, Elizabeth, I just want to welcome you, and I hope I didn't butcher your title or your position too badly here. So, what do you think about that introduction around the distinction between leader and leadership? I'll just start with that.
Well, listen, first of all, Blaine, thank you. It's a pleasure. And this is like one of my favorite topics. So, I'm chomping at the bit here to jump in with you. Yeah, and I should note, I'm part of our senior leadership team in our East region at BTS, and maybe a very quick BTS, commercial, if you will. But we're in about 35 countries around the world. And so what you describe in terms of leadership absolutely lands with me. I love the way you framed it, that it's about movement. Because I would say we speak the same mind or thought there, Blaine. BTS was formed about 35 years ago with the idea that, listen, you can have a great strategy. The best strategies in the world will fail if we're not really paying attention to our people, if we're not creating that movement that you described. It's how you execute and implement that strategy, how the mind share and heart share around a strategy, how we equip and build capability, all the things that, of course, I know you're deeply immersed in and have built your career around. And I'm guessing, folks maybe listening in understand this, whatever side of the coin you're on. So it's all about movement. And listen, I have to say that to myself too every day. What am I doing to move the needle for myself, for my clients, and how do we help them move the needle in the areas where they need to? I think that's the work that we do, and I'm guessing a lot of us listening are interested in.
Well, that the whole question of movement, we're either moving towards something or away from something, typically. And as an organization grows and matures, typically the movement is away from the soul of the business, that kernel that actually sparked the innovation that ended up becoming that company, whatever it might have been. In your experience, Elizabeth, and with the work that you've done with your clients, and particularly, I mean, you worked with some of the Fortune 50s, as have I, and that question about how you stay connected to that core kernel that makes it's you can't replicate it. Yeah, yeah. And how do you work with your clients? How have you worked with your clients and the success that you've seen with this in keeping people connected to that germ?
Yeah. Yes. And I love the soul of a business really is something we would describe as permanent. And
Mhm.
so, at least that is the way that I think about it, Blaine. So we can shift our strategy, we can add assets, we can grow, we can add offices and all sorts of things. But what is that essential truth, within a company? And so I would say, to answer your question, let's make sure we've defined what that is, and
Mhm.
that people know what that is. And there are a million ways to express what that is, both
Mhm.
in terms of how you show up, how you think, how you feel, what you do, of course. And so, hey, we're expanding into China. That's okay. I still understand what the soul of the company is.
Yeah.
Even if my role changes, how do I retain that? And so I think that's harder today. I mean, there's just no question. It's just finding ways to think about how do we retain that, define that, create that understanding and retain that. That really is the work that I see of executive leadership. It is a tall order, but it's a must do.
The way you describe that and talk about it, it reminded me of some of the early work I did with Nokia in the mid 1990s when I started working with them. They were this conglomerate. They had rubber boots. They sold farming implements. They had TV
Oh
sets.
wow.
They had cables. I mean, Nokia is 150 some years old, I think, round numbers. But what I was intrigued by was their use of values. And,
Mm-hmm.
and where I'm going to go with this is um, Jorma Ollila, who was the chairman of or the CEO at the time. He was the CEO at that point in time. He brought in Mike Hammer from Harvard, and they had developed the strategic focus for the organization going forward in the mid 90s as they divested all of these ancillary products and divisions and focused on telecom. And what happened there was they had this thing that they called Vision 2000. And so when you ask what's the vision for the company, they said it's Vision 2000, and people go, well, what does that mean? And the answer was always, that's a good question. How would you answer it? And the framing that made it
Mm-hmm.
possible to answer it was the four core values that they had articulated as something that we are going to true to,
Yeah.
regardless of whatever we're doing out here. We're going to true to these four core values. So as we migrate into China, as we move into
Mm-hmm.
Africa,
Yeah.
whatever it may have been, how do these four core values impact what we're doing? And what was fascinating to me about this was I cannot remember in the almost 12 years that I worked with them as an external consultant, I can't remember a single meeting where we had four or more people that we didn't have a conversation about the values if there was a decision
Wow.
being made. And it wasn't just a pro forma check the box; it was
Mm-hmm.
inculcated into the
Yeah.
culture. It was in the
Yes.
water. That's just what we
Yes.
do.
Yeah.
And so for me, that was one way that Nokia, as they grew, and they ended up with over 100,000 employees at that time, kept themselves true to the soul of the business, and it was through the use of their value core, not a spout, and not the values that you'd see on the wall, but the ones that they actually practiced, the ones that they actually practiced.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I think what you said, that idea of, so how do you really embed and inculcate to get to the point where you can be in a meeting anywhere in a company and somehow that gets surfaced? That's just an incredible feat. And so that's a real credit to them and their leadership at that time, because you really do have to think about, as we were saying, let's understand what are those values
Yeah.
that really represent our heritage, our legacy, what matters to us, what we stand for, the promises that we make, right? So even just landing on those values is such an important work.
Oh yeah.
And then, right, it can all flow from there.
You know, and I'll just kind of continue this thread here a little bit. I find this fascinating. I really do, because every organization I've ever worked with has got a vision statement. And they usually have articulated values, espoused values, and they'll say, "Where are they? What are they?" And they say, "Well, they'll point to the wall, and they've got it framed up on a picture." And that's where it sits. I mean, it
Yes.
doesn't have any life in it. Or somebody will say, "Well, wait a minute, I've got it here in my wallet," and they're sitting on it. Um, and the vision is being sat on. Um, when you think about this in the context of growing an organization. And this is, I think, where your work with the companies with whom you've worked, and also with BTS, is just background of 35 years and the number of countries that you operate in. The diversity in leadership roles comes into play when you start interpreting values.
Yeah.
Because when I say integrity as an example, it can mean something very different depending on what part of the world I'm actually coming from
Yeah.
and operating in. What have you found as a way, if I could put you on the spot here just a little bit, how do you actually cross the chasm here where people have different meanings assigned to a
Yes.
quote unquote supposedly commonly understood value?
Yeah. And it's so common what you're describing. We have these kind of, look, lofty, broad terms that can, right, sort of mean 100 different things. And so one of the things that I have just loved about BTS is the idea of authorship is ownership.
Hmm.
Authorship is ownership. And so the importance of co-creating value, strategy, plans, operating models really is what we find starts to get agreement, alignment, adoption. So if you go back to, well, how do we start to understand a word like integrity or, whatever the case may be? I think that idea of how do we get some co-creating around it? And so I think it's important to define, here's what we mean by that at this company. But find ways to get the different voices of your employees from around the world to be part of that dialogue. And
Mm-hmm.
look, there are a million ways to do that, right? There's lots of ways that we can co-author and create together so that that word has meaning and resonance for me if I'm in Japan, if I'm in North America. And I think that's really important, particularly for when we start to talk about our larger companies. Listen, many of them, they know this, they understand and practice this. The global local dichotomy. They've got to be able to create sort of a global North Star that really makes sense to your employees in Brazil and your employees in, Alberta, Canada. And that starts at that values level.
Yeah. And I think, when it starts to come down to, where the rubber meets the road in part here, and this is something that I know that you've been particularly involved with, and it's something that was highlighted in a recent SHRM study on the shifting demographics of C-suite executives. They're aging out, and that's part of it, but also increased diversity in the C-suite ranks
Mm-hmm,
themselves.
mm-hmm.
What are some of for you, just based on both your work experience, but also the observations that you have inside of these organizations? And I'm going to put this back in the context of keeping connected to the soul of the business. Uh, what are some of the strategic implications for some of the changes that you're seeing in the C-suite right now?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, you identified, I think, a really key one. So we're seeing in the C-suite, and the study you're citing comes from, I think, the Wharton Center of Human Resources. And what's interesting is they have looked at who's in the C-suite and what have been the changes really at that Fortune 100 level. So some
Yeah.
of our biggest companies in the world since about 1980. So interesting to note, as you say, average age of our C-suite leaders is about 57. So
Mm-hmm.
that's just a bit older than what we've seen. And so, what are some of the implications? Some ways we can say, all right, well, let's just think about even what does your average C-suite executive have to grapple with? Supply chain complexity, much more diverse workforce, hybrid workforce, just, very matrix. So the level of challenge, investors, activist investors, we could go on. So
Oh,
it's a
yeah.
hard job. And so all the more challenging to retain that soul. And what I am seeing right now is there's the defining, if you will, of the soul. So those important anchor elements. Do we have a clear vision? Do we have those values that support that vision? The work that I often do with leadership, it's how do we operationalize and translate that
Mm-hmm.
into practical kind of activities the practical steps that we need to take an idea of, we're going to be the most innovative material science company in the world, to, okay, so how does that translate into our areas of strategic focus in terms of even processes, and so on. And so I think that's where I see a lot of C-suite executives in my world have to spend more time than ever. We cannot assume that the value of our values is obvious to people. And so how do we help employees wherever they sit in the world, whether they're at home or in the office, make that meaningful for them?
Yeah.
So that's the work I see leaders having to do at that level. And
Yeah.
not easy.
We're going to take a real quick break. When we come back, this question of meaning, I think, is going to be useful to explore, because I want to move it, our conversation away from the large enterprise and down into more mid-sized to smaller organizations. And I think meaning is the bridge that we can use to make that transition effective. So we're going to, folks, take a real quick break, speaking with Elizabeth Freedman, and we'll be right back. Hi, I'd like to ask you to do something for me, if you wouldn't mind. If you like this episode, I'd like you to not only subscribe on your favorite site, but I'd also like you to give a rating. Ideally, a 5-star rating would be greatly appreciated. But I think more importantly also would be just some comments. That helps with the algorithm, and it helps build the audience with this. And more than anything else, if you could invite somebody else to listen, just share this episode with a friend, with a colleague. And I'd like to see how we can grow the soul of business. I think it makes a difference. Thanks. Welcome back, folks. Before we took a break, Elizabeth and I were kind of going back and forth on a couple of different topics here. And one of them had to do, just prior to the break, around an executive or a leader being able to make meaningful that work in a way that the people that are doing that work actually can resonate with. Because if it's not meaningful to them, they're not going to do anything with it, quite frankly. I mean, they'll do enough to get by. But in terms of ownership, as an example here, authorship is ownership, those sorts of things kind of come into play here. If I'm running a smaller business enterprise, and I'm going to move it from 100,000 people down to maybe 10 or 15 people here, the elements of the business remain the same. I've still got supply chain. I've got all of the things that a business is going to have, or an organization is going to have. The scale is different. I'm more likely to be able to have one-on-one conversations with my people, probably more personal conversations. When the notion of making things meaningful comes into play, what differences might you see between a large enterprise manager / leader that has got a head count or a span of control of 50, 60, 80, 100, 200 people, and one that's got, the whole company's got 10 people in it? What conversation difference do you see going on there that would be useful to pay attention to?
Yes. Well, if I were to talk to anyone, solopreneur, maybe you've got a very small team out there. In some ways, wow, just what a wonderful advantage. For the reason you just described, Blaine, you've got such proximity to your people. And so you're going to find out real quick, I would say, whether or not work feels meaningful to them. Right. So presumably you're having such a level of frequency in terms of interaction that you are afforded, the chance to ask different types of questions. What are you looking forward to right now? What does feel meaningful about this work? Tell me why this matters to you. Why are you here? And so those are the types of questions, quite frankly, any leader could be dripping into their conversations. What's interesting though, Blade, and what your question makes me think about, when I work with leaders, and I work with many leaders who are running smaller organizations, small mom and pop shops, smaller firms, 100 people or less. And it is an interesting thing in that they tend to focus a lot more on, how do I get my team to get the things done that I need them to do?
Yeah.
And so it's not that they are dismissive of meaning. So in our large companies, we see engagement surveys. We see all kinds of mechanisms to try to assess, are employees engaged? How are they finding meeting? We put big programs and initiatives in place, of course, as you know, right, to be able to increase the level of meaning and understand what motivates our employees and build whole talent strategies to really, tap into that. Small companies, you don't see a lot of those elements.
Right.
It's right, much more about, I really need this stuff to get done. And so often I see the uncovering of, hey, why aren't you getting this done? Dealing with some of the conflict on their own teams, even managing others for the first time, that I see that, let's say, the meaning question come up. But in my experience, it's not the first question I usually see for smaller organizations.
Yeah. See, that to me is just fascinating, because that is where the true jewel is. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
If we're successful doing this, what does it make possible for you? I think is a great question to be asking people. If
Love
you're
that.
successful at doing this, what does it make possible for you? I know what it makes possible for us, as a company, but what does it make possible for you? And if they can land on an answer to that, all of a sudden you now have something that's meaningful.
Yes.
And the old adage about how I describe something determines how I feel about it. How I feel about it generates my behavior. So if I want people to feel as if they're actually owning the result of the company, owning who we are, I guess would be an easier way of saying it. Owning who we are, I have to change their description process. If I try to just
Absolutely.
focus on change behavior, anybody that's ever been married or been in a significant relationship and has tried to change their partner, they know what a fool's errand that is.
Oh, right you are, sir. And but
Oh
it's so
boy.
true. And we kind of come into the conversation sort of two steps ahead of where we want to be. It's, here's what I need you to do. Why aren't you doing it?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I need to clarify what I need you to do. And we have to take a couple steps back and appreciate again what does create that meaning? Why would this be important? And all those other questions that you've pointed out. Real important.
Yeah, and if we're looking through the lens of leadership is about causing movement, movement is a consequence of meaning.
Yes.
I mean, it
Yeah.
basically is that simple. Or lack of movement is also a consequence of
Yeah.
absence of meaning in many cases.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And the mistake that I've made like 1,000 times, Blaine, is um it's meaningful to me. Of course it should be meaningful to you. And so all those assumptions.
Yeah.
And can't you see why this is meaningful? Why do I have to explain this to you? And so we can get caught in that kind of thinking. And so, it's back to your earlier point. Of course, we don't all think the same things are meaningful. And even when it's on the wall in our office and when we all get trained on it, we still can't assume that that is meaningful in the way it might be to you and me. And so again, back to this idea of having a different type of conversation with your employees, not making assumptions, big or small. And if I may, even if you are a business of one, which is also fantastic, it's continuing to connect into the meaning for you. Because I'll tell you, having worked for years and years and years in sales, running sales teams, consulting teams, we have to get up every day and remind ourselves, why do I want to do this again? What's meaningful about this? We all know that, but it's got to be almost a discipline. And so I
I
think
mean,
those are other elements that help.
yeah, and I think discipline's a good word for that. Simon Sinek talks about, first, get the why in place. I love that. And it doesn't go far enough in my experience. And this is what you're speaking to, I think. And it has to do with that personal, for the sake of what?
Yes.
Why is one thing. And it tends to be omnidirectional because it can point to a whole lot of different things. But for the sake of
Mm-hmm.
what? Kind of zooms
Yes.
things in pretty tightly. This
Yes.
this is what matters. This is what
Oh,
matters.
and back to your earlier question, what's going on with the C-suite right now? They are just inundated. Every single one of my clients is up to their eyeballs all the time, no time to think.
Mm-hmm.
So to be able to be a voice that provides focus and clarity, that helps us stay focused on the things that matter, that helps us remember what's meaningful to us. Seems crazy that we would forget that, But my gosh, Blaine, we do. I certainly do. I have to remind myself, as I said. So those individuals that can, yes, paint that picture of the why, but provide that focus is to me the magic ingredient.
Yeah. And, and I'll just check my thinking out on this with you. Language, I've got a meme that I work off of. Language creates reality, but it also reflects an internal reality.
Mm-hmm.
So how I speak something actually is very much aligned with what's going on in my brain, in my mind. The idea of paying attention to the linguistic profiles of the people that I work with. And by linguistic profiles, I'm an example of this: hospital systems. Key constituencies are the doctors, the nurses, the administrators, and the patients. Those are the four key constituencies in a hospital system. They each have their own language profile. It's fascinating. It's a healthcare environment, but the nurses are going to be talking about care. They're going to be talking about compassion a lot of times. Docs are going to be diagnosing and prescribing. Administrators are going to be looking at ROI, cost benefit, and patients are concerned with, am I safe? So a lot of their conversations around safety. And if I'm not teeing, and this is where meaning comes into play, if I'm a doc, as an example, diagnose and prescribe, quicker the better. And a nurse is going, care, compassion. I've got, it's kind of, all of a sudden we've got this clash of expectations.
Yes.
In your experience with this, and this is not just germane to a healthcare environment, I think every environment has got this kind of a linguistic, profile distinctions to it. Where do we run the risk of, or what's the risk we run? And it's a self-answering question, I think, but what's the risk we run if we're not, as leaders, attuned to paying attention to how people present themselves, present their version of reality?
Well, I think the word attunement is everything. Are we aware? How do we show others we are aware while still being who we are? And so, listen, there are multi-generations within a workplace. And this is not, nor are you suggesting, Blaine, a CEO has to embody the kind of speech language of maybe a new Gen Zer, in the office or what have you. But what's underneath that language? What does, do we reflect that? And also, I'll add this, and I think, this is probably certainly well understood by folks in the solopreneur small business world. We just gain so much credibility when we can tap into that without pretending we've worked, in their organization for 25 years. For example, I have a client who refers to their customers as users. These are our users. And I was referring to their users as their clients. It was a disconnect.
Yeah.
And so I was not just missing the fact that they used a different word, but they just had a very different lens on who buys their stuff, frankly. And so I had to address that and fix that.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. It really is. Because embedded in the language is a for the sake of what?
Yeah.
What matters to me?
That's right.
Sort of a thing.
Yes. Yeah.
All of this, I think, in part requires on a leader the willingness, and I'm going to use the word willingness here, to continuously develop themselves. And I know for me, and I'm assuming for you, although we've just met here, but I think it's a valid assumption just based on my experience with you, self-development is absolutely essential if I'm going to be effective in a leadership role. It's not about, can I manage people? Can I check the boxes? It's, I set the ceiling on where my people go. I've set the ceiling on where my organization goes. And if I'm not willing to examine that ceiling that I've set, we're dead in the water.
Yes. Oh, I mean, this we could talk about all day, Blaine. And I don't know if I've got the expression right: to grow the business, you have to grow the leaders that grow the business.
Yep.
Absolutely essential. And to state the obvious, even more so at those executive levels, there's just no way in my mind to manage that level of complexity without having just deep self-awareness, thoughtful sounding boards in a confidential way, whether that's coaching or some other environment. But I think to your earlier point, and people that understand your context, they don't have to be you, but they have to be knowledgeable enough, have enough reference points to say, hey, no, you're not crazy. Yes, this is normal. Here's what else we see happening with leaders like you.
Yeah.
And understand their world and help them navigate it. I just don't know how else to do it. It's essential.
Yeah. And that's a lot of the work that you know, at BTS actually facilitate. We're coming close here, unfortunately, to where I need to wrap. But I want to actually, what are some of the things that BTS that you're actually excited about?
I love it. Yes, meaning, right?
Meaning, yeah.
Yeah.
What's going on here?
Blaine, I have personally been immersed in the work of executive leadership for, well over a decade, 15, 20 years now. And so a lot of the work we do today is around one. So back to values. How do we develop executive leaders? How do we select leaders that not only can embody and live these values, but bring others along? So really kind of deepen the soul of our business, if you will, that understand what it is, have a way of demonstrating that and bringing others along. And so all the work around C-suite succession, executive succession, we do a lot in that space to help companies define that, ways to measure and evaluate that, select, and then help those leaders really thrive in those roles. And so do a lot of work there. And also, Blaine, one of the things that we're really focused on is what are the practical ways that you develop executives of tomorrow? So when we've got leaders, how do you help them really engage in their businesses through simulation, through really let's practice and test out the things that we know you're going to be having to lead and do so that you don't just come into a role and surprise, you don't have to lead, a massive project. And so I think, again, it comes back to that idea of how do we make executive leadership practical? How do we make more people know it's available to them?
Mm-hmm.
That there is a big circle and making leaders, want to be part of that, because the truth is, Blaine, we need, I think now more than ever, we need great people running our companies.
Oh.
And so how do we help the leaders of tomorrow be able to do that? And so that's the work.
Yeah. And, that's very consistent. The way that I've defined leadership is it's the process of co-creating coordinated movement in pursuit of a worthy ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And you get those pieces in play.
Yeah.
And, you're off to the races. And that is a skill set. And it's about leadership. That's all a movement. That's the movement parameter. Yeah.
That's right.
Where can people find out more about either BTS or you specifically if they wanted to reach out and say,
well, first of all, I always love to have conversations like this. And so please come check me out on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there, Elizabeth Freedman. I write a regular column for Forbes on these ideas. And so always love to get feedback and reaction to that. And Blaine, I would love for people to just check out BTS. That's BTS.com. Come to the website and see the work that we're doing in this space and how we're working to create movement and meaning inside companies around the world.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. I've loved this conversation, and I love the work that you're doing. It's just been a pleasure.
Likewise. The pleasure was mine. Thank you. I love it. Thank you so much, Blaine. It's been my honor.
Folks have been listening to my conversation with Elizabeth Freedman. As we close off here, as always, I'm going to just kind of put a little bee in your bonnet here and say, go out into your world, whatever your world is comprised of, and be a center of distribution, not a center of accumulation. When you're being a center of distribution, you're going to find that things work a whole lot better. And it's an abundant universe. So give what you can away, and you'll be very pleased that you did. And until next time, I'll see you later.